The dust was still in his lungs when the order came down the line. Strip, drop everything, walk toward the water. Anton Weller had survived El Alameen's retreat, the sinking heat of the Tunisian desert, and 11 days locked in the dark hold of a troop ship that reeked of vomit and diesel. And none of it had prepared him for the moment an American sergeant handed him a bar of soap and told him, almost gently, to scrub behind his ears. He thought it was a trick. Every man in that line thought it was a trick. They stood in rows under the merciless Oklahoma sun, 1,700 German prisoners of war fresh off the train from the coast, their uniforms crusted with salt and sand and months of retreat, and they watched the Americans set up folding tables loaded with towels, razors, tins of foot powder, and stacks of clean white undergarments folded with a precision that looked almost obscene. Somewhere down the line, a man started laughing, the kind of laugh that comes from a throat too tired to cry. He kept saying the same word over and over, verrückt, madness. Anton did not laugh. Anton watched. He had been a Feldwebel in the 21st Panzer Division, a man who once commanded 30 soldiers and outran British tanks through minefields. And now he stood barefoot on gravel in a country he had been trained to hate, waiting to be told what a shower was for. The camp was called Camp Gruber, though nobody had told them that yet, and it sat in the rolling green hills east of Muskogee, Oklahoma, a place so far from the war that the silence itself felt like an insult. No artillery, no engines, no screaming, just whined through tall grass and the distant clang of a mess hall bell, and underneath all of it, a question that gnawed at every prisoner standing in that line. What do they want from us? Because in the world Anton came from, this was not how enemies treated each other. He had seen what happened to men who fell into the wrong hands on the Eastern Front, had heard the stories whispered around campfires by men too afraid to write them home. He had grown up on propaganda reels that painted Americans as soft, decadent, cruel in their own particular way, capitalist wolves who would work a man to death in some frozen labor camp and call it justice. He had prepared himself for filth, for hunger, for the low animal indignity of captivity. He had not prepared himself for a barber. The line moved forward in fits and starts, prisoners funneling through a wooden archway into a long tin-roofed building that hummed with unfamiliar sound. Running water. Lots of it. More water than Anton had seen used for bathing since before the war began. Steam rose in pale curtains from a row of shower heads bolted to the ceiling, and American soldiers, young men who looked barely old enough to shave themselves, stood at intervals holding clipboards, checking names, gesturing prisoners toward stalls with the bored efficiency of men doing a job they had done 1,000 times before. A prisoner, 2 men, head of Anton, refused to move. He was older, a Feldwebel like Anton, with a scar that ran from his jaw to his collarbone and eyes that had seen things no man should carry home. He planted his boots and would not walk into that room, would not undress, would not let a young American soldier hand him a bar of soap, because in his mind, and Anton understood this instantly, felt the cold drop of recognition in his own stomach. Showers were not showers. Showers were something else. Rumors traveled through prison camps like disease, and this man had heard enough of them, twisted second-hand through interrogation rooms and transport ships, to believe that clean rooms with nozzles in the ceiling were never what they seemed. The room went quiet. Even the water seemed to hold its breath. An American sergeant stepped forward, a broad-shouldered Oklahoman named Walt Hendricks, who had grown up on a cattle ranch outside Ponca City and had absolutely no patience for delay. But something in the prisoner's face made him stop before he barked an order. Hendricks had processed 9 transport groups through this delousing station since the camp opened, had seen fear in 100 different forms, but this fear was different. This fear had a shape to it, a history. He did not speak German, but he set his clipboard down on the bench, slow and deliberate, the way a man moves when he wants to be understood without words, and he walked to the nearest shower head and turned it on himself. Cold water first, then hot steam rising around his own collar, his own boots, soaking his own uniform sleeve to the elbow. He stood there and let it hit him and looked the old Feldwebel dead in the eye, and something in that simple, stupid, soaking wet gesture cracked the fear just enough to let air back into the room. The prisoner walked forward. He did not smile, But he walked forward. Anton watched all of it happen from 4 places back in line, and something shifted behind his ribs that he would spend the rest of his life trying to name. It wasn't gratitude, not yet. It was something closer to disorientation, the vertigo of watching a wall you'd built your whole understanding of the world around simply refuse to be there. When his own turn came, he undressed without protest, handed his filthy uniform to a supply clerk who tagged it, folded it, and set it aside for laundering rather than burning, and stepped under water hot enough to sting the cracked skin on his hands. He had not felt hot water in 4 months. He stood under it longer than he should have, and nobody rushed him. On the other side of the showers, the transformation continued in ways that felt almost cruel in their thoroughness. A line of American medics, actual medics, with actual training, not the exhausted field surgeons who patched wounds with whatever cloth was closest, inspected each prisoner for lice, for open sores, for the rot that crept into a man's feet after months in wet boots. A dentist, an honest-to-God dentist with a portable chair and gleaming steel instruments, pulled Anton aside because his back molar had been aching since Tripoli, numbed the gum with something that made his whole jaw go pleasantly dead, and extracted the tooth in 4 minutes with less pain than the toothache itself had caused him in a single hour. Anton sat in that chair afterward, blood and cotton in his cheek, and watched the dentist, a balding man named Dr. Iverson who whistled while he worked, move on to the next prisoner without so much as a glance at rank insignia, without checking whether the man in the chair was a general or a private, without any of the calculus that governed every interaction Anton had grown up watching adults perform. The dentist simply fixed what was broken because it was broken. It did something to a man, watching that. By nightfall, the 1,700 prisoners who had arrived that morning looking like ghosts of an army now sat in a mess hall eating stew with actual meat in it, wearing clean denim work uniforms, stenciled with the letters PW across the back, their hair cut short, and even their faces scraped clean of months of stubble. The barbershop had run 12 straight hours. The laundry had processed more filthy uniforms in one day than most of these men's home villages laundered in a month. Anton sat at a long table across from a younger soldier named Erich Vogt, barely 19, who had been drafted out of a Munich technical school and had never fired a weapon before Tunisia, and Erich kept turning his spoon over and over in his hand like he didn't trust it to be real. "They cut my hair," Erich said quietly, and then the barber apologized when he nicked my ear, apologized to me. Anton did not have an answer for that. He simply ate his stew and let the strangeness of the day settle into his bones like sediment. Word of Camp Gruber's hygiene regime spread through the American prison camp system the way all military rumors spread, through letters home, through transferred prisoners, through the mouths of guards who told stories to their wives over supper. The regime wasn't unique to Gruber. It was policy, dictated from Washington down through the Geneva Conventions the United States had signed, and more remarkably to men like Anton, actually intended to follow. Every incoming prisoner was to be deloused, medically examined, dentally treated, and issued clean clothing and bedding, regardless of rank, regardless of the crimes their army might have committed an ocean away. It was not kindness exactly. It was procedure. But procedure built on a foundation that assumed even an enemy soldier retained some baseline of human dignity. And that assumption was, to men raised inside a machine that treated dignity as a currency to be rationed and withheld, the single most disorienting thing about American captivity. The days that followed built a routine that felt, to Anton's own discomfort, almost peaceful. Reveille at 6. A breakfast that included real coffee, eggs some mornings, bread that didn't taste of sawdust. Work details in the surrounding farmland, picking cotton or baling hay for local farmers whose own sons were fighting somewhere in Europe or the Pacific. A fact that struck Anton as almost unbearably strange, that he might spend his morning working a field for a woman whose husband was, at that very hour, possibly aiming a rifle at a man who looked exactly like him. He wrote to his mother in Freiburg for the first time in 6 months, and the letter went through actual mail channels, actual Red Cross oversight, actual delivery, not the black hole of silence he had feared. He described the camp in careful, restrained language, aware that any letter might be read by sensors on both ends, but he allowed himself one honest line near the close of the page. "They keep us cleaner here than the army ever did. I do not understand it yet, but I am beginning to." The hygiene inspections continued weekly, feet checked for rot, teeth checked for decay, uniforms laundered on a rotation that would have made his own quartermaster back in Africa weep with envy. Sergeant Hendricks, the broad-shouldered rancher's son who had stood soaking wet under that first shower to prove a point without words, became something like a fixture in Anton's daily life, a gruff, mostly silent presence who ran the camp's sanitation details with the same unglamorous discipline he'd probably once used to keep cattle from dying of preventable disease back home. He didn't speak to the prisoners much. He didn't need to. His authority lived in the fact that every system he ran actually worked, that the water was actually hot, that the soap was actually enough, that the promises stamped in triplicate on official camp policy documents actually translated into the tangible daily experience of not itching, not aching, not rotting. It took Anton nearly 3 months to understand why the disconnect bothered him so deeply. And when the understanding finally arrived, it arrived at night, lying on a real mattress in a real barracks, staring at a ceiling that did not leak. He had been taught from boyhood that strength meant hardness, and hardness meant the willingness to let suffering exist unaddressed, to treat weakness, illness, filth, injury, as something close to moral failure, a thing to be endured silently or purged. The army had reinforced this at every level, had built an entire culture around the idea that comfort corrupted a soldier, that cleanliness was vanity, that a hard man did not need soft things. And yet here he was, cleaner and healthier than he had been in 2 years of active service, guarded by an enemy who apparently believed that keeping a man's teeth from rotting in his skull was not softness at all, but simply what decent people did to other people, regardless of the uniform. The thought terrified him more than any battlefield had. Because if the Americans were right, if dignity wasn't a resource to be earned through suffering, if cleanliness and care could coexist with military discipline rather than undermine it, then something at the root of everything Anton had been trained to believe was rotten in a way no shower could clean. He didn't say any of this out loud. Not yet. But he started watching Hendricks differently, started noticing the small mercies the man extended without ceremony, an extra blanket quietly left near a prisoner running a fever, a work detail rescheduled around a man's aching back, a birthday acknowledged with nothing more than a nod and a second helping of stew. None of it was written in any regulation. It was simply the way the sergeant chose to run his corner of the war. The turning point, when it came, arrived in late October, when a diphtheria scare swept through a neighboring section of the camp, and the American medical staff responded with a speed and thoroughness that left even the camp commander's German liaison officer stunned. Every prisoner in the affected barracks was isolated, examined, and treated within 18 hours. Vaccines that should, by the logic Anton had been raised on, have gone first to American troops and only ever trickled down to prisoners as an afterthought, were administered without hesitation, without distinction, without a single moment of the calculus he expected. 3 prisoners in the neighboring barracks might have died of that outbreak in the camps he'd heard about from other fronts. None did here. Erich Vogt, the 19-year-old from Munich, caught the fever late one night, and Anton sat beside his cot in the infirmary until dawn, watching an American nurse, a woman. Which was its own quiet shock to men raised inside a rigidly gendered military culture, check his temperature every hour with a gentleness that had nothing performative about it. She didn't know Erich's name meant anything. She didn't know he'd once been terrified of firing his first weapon. She simply did her job, checked his fever, adjusted his blanket, and moved to the next cot. Erich survived. He came back to the barracks 8 days later, thinner, quieter, and profoundly changed. "I keep thinking," he told Anton one evening, sitting on the barracks steps as the Oklahoma sky burned orange over the tree line, "about what would have happened to me at home if I'd gotten sick like that in a camp back in Germany. Would anyone have come?" Anton didn't answer, because he didn't trust himself to say the true answer out loud, not even here, not even now. By the spring of 1944, Camp Gruber had become something Anton could never have imagined standing in that first shower line 8 months earlier. Not a prison exactly, though the watchtowers and barbed wire never let a man forget what he was, but a place where the daily mechanics of survival had stopped being a battle. He had gained back the weight he'd lost in the desert. His hands had healed. He slept without waking at every distant sound, because there were no distant sounds worth waking for. He began teaching some of the younger prisoners basic English in the evenings, using a battered dictionary donated by the camp library, and in exchange, an American guard named Corporal Danny Reyes, a quiet kid from Texas who'd been rejected from combat duty for a heart murmur, and resented it bitterly, started teaching Anton how to play baseball with a bat carved crooked by a prisoner in the camp's small workshop. It was an absurd friendship by every rule Anton had once lived by. He was the enemy. Reyes guarded him with a rifle slung over one shoulder, even as he explained the difference between a curveball and a fastball with genuine, boyish enthusiasm. "You know," Reyes said one afternoon, watching Anton badly miss a pitch for the 4th time in a row, "my old man says keeping you fellas clean and fed is the smartest thing this country's ever done. Says an enemy you treat decent is an enemy who might not hate you forever." Anton lowered the bat and looked at him for a long moment. "And does it work, this theory of your father's?" Reyes shrugged, tossing the ball up and catching it. "Ask me again after the war." Anton thought about that exchange for a long time afterward, turning it over the way he once turned over tactical problems on a map table in North Africa. He thought about the shower line, about Hendrik standing soaked to prove a point, about the dentist who fixed a tooth without checking rank, about the nurse who watched Erich's fever break without ever knowing his name meant anything to anyone. He thought about the machine that had raised him, the one that measured a man's worth by his hardness and treated mercy as contamination. And he thought about this strange, sprawling, contradictory country that fed its prisoners better than some of its own citizens likely ate, that pulled rotten teeth and treated fevers, and handed out clean underwear with the same bureaucratic indifference it might use to process a shipment of mail. He was not naive. He knew there was calculation buried somewhere beneath the kindness. Geneva Conventions were policy as much as principle, and policy always served some larger interest. He knew American camps elsewhere had their own failures, their own cruelties, their own men who abused the power handed to them. But he had lived inside this particular corner of it long enough to know that the baseline decency he'd witnessed here was not performance. It was habit. And habits, he was beginning to understand, revealed more about a people than their propaganda ever could. The war ended in Europe in May of 1945, and the news reached Camp Gruber not through triumphant announcement, but through a quiet radio broadcast that drifted out of the guardhouse and across the yard. And Anton stood in the evening light listening to a language he barely understood deliver the end of everything he had once believed he was fighting for. Some prisoners wept. Some stood in furious silence. Anton felt something closer to exhaustion, the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent years bracing for a blow that has finally landed. He would not go home for another 18 months. Held as labor in the agricultural fields of a country he had once been trained to despise. And in those 18 months, he thought often about that first shower line, about the terrified Feldwebel who refused to walk forward until an American sergeant stood soaking wet to prove there was nothing to fear. He thought about how strange it was that the single moment that broke something open in him, that first crack in a lifetime of conditioning, had not been a battle, not a surrender, not a speech, but a bar of soap and a country that seemed to genuinely believe cleanliness was owed to any man, friend, or enemy, simply because he was a man. When he finally boarded the ship home to a Germany he barely recognized, his uniform pressed and his teeth intact, and his body carrying more weight than it had in years of war, he carried something else with him too, something without a name in any language he spoke fluently. Not gratitude exactly, not forgiveness. Something closer to a question that would follow him the rest of his life, a question about what kind of strength actually lasts and what kind simply breaks. He never forgot the smell of that first shower. Hot water, harsh soap, and underneath it all, the disorienting, impossible scent of an enemy choosing decency when cruelty would have cost them nothing at all.